who's going to do your intro.
Okay.
All right, so I want to welcome everybody on the call to today's OBSSR Directors webinar. It's titled the Eureka Research Platform, a resource for mobilizing research. I'm Christine Hunter. I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research at the National Institutes of Health. And before I introduce today's speaker, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. So first, today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available in about 2 weeks on the OBSSR website. After today's presentation, it'll be followed by a Q&A session. So all phone lines will be muted during the webinar, and questions and comments will not be taken via the phone, but will be taken via WebEx Q&A or chat features. So if you want to ask a question or send a comment, click on the Q&A, select all panelists, type in your question, and send. So you can feel free to send a question at any time during the webinar. And then following the presentation, OBSSR's Mike Spittle will facilitate the Q&A session and ask your questions to the presenter. And so without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Jeffrey Olgin. Dr. Olgin is the Gallo-Chatterjee Distinguished Professor of Medicine and Chief of the Division of Cardiology at the University of California, San Francisco. He's the principal investigator of the VEST study. It's a large multi-center randomized study investigating ways to prevent sudden cardiac death after a heart attack. Dr. Olgin and his colleagues have started the Health eHeart study, an innovative approach of leveraging the internet, mobile and sensor technology to collect massive amounts of data in real life and real time to develop better prediction algorithms for heart disease, develop new mobile health technology, and innovate new paradigms for disease management. He also leads an NIH-funded initiative to create and run a resource for efficiently running clinical studies using mobile and digital technology called Eureka. His basic research laboratory studies mechanisms of abnormal heart rhythms and strives to understand the mechanisms of unique changes that occur in the atria of people who will develop atrial fibrillation. Dr. Olgin's research attempts to identify molecular pathways that promote these changes to develop therapies that can prevent atrial fibrillation from occurring. So it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Olgin to present today on the Eureka Research Platform, a resource for mobilizing research.
Thank you very much. So I guess my main disclosure is, as you heard, I'm not a behavioral researcher. I'm a hardcore cardiologist, electrophysiologist, but entered into this space really out of some frustrations in running large clinical trials and trying to develop novel approaches to scale up and develop methodology for doing more cost-effective clinical trials and clinical research. So about 5 or 6 years ago now, we embarked on what was then an experiment to see if we could enroll and engage an entirely remote cohort for clinical research. It took some innovation with our IRB to allow for completely remote consenting and developing technology that allowed us to engage a spectrum of people across ages in an electronic cohort, which we call the Healthy Heart Study. And this slide is now about 3 or 4 weeks old. We now have about 250,000 participants and volunteers in the cohort, providing data and serving as a volunteer cohort for rapid randomized registry studies, and I'll go through some examples of all that. About 3 or 4 years ago, we responded to an NIH RFA to develop a research platform for what they call mobilizing research. Those aren't my words, those are the NIH words, with the idea of trying to develop a disease-agnostic, scalable, efficient platform for researchers around the country or around the world to do digital mobile research quicker and more efficiently. And so we call this the Eureka Mobile Research Platform, and I'll talk at length about that over the next 30 or 40 minutes. But it also involves creating a cohort of volunteers to facilitate doing this kind of research rapidly, and we call this the Eureka community. And so the 250 or so odd volunteer participants that I mentioned earlier have become part of this community, and as you'll see in some of the examples, can be leveraged to enroll in randomized trials very rapidly. And then lastly, to take this data that we collect and create a de-identified data set that will be available to researchers who want to just do secondary data analyses on this types of data. So our goals for this project that we set out with the NIH were really these three pillars. And again, I'll talk mostly about this first pillar of our research platform and touch a little bit on the community. So what is the Eureka platform? Again, as I mentioned, we built it as a scalable, nimble platform for conducting research using mobile and internet technology. We've built it and have studies on it that are entirely remote, studies that are in-person studies, but leverage the platform for collecting at-home or remote data. And then we have studies where there are hybrids of the two. We spent the first year of our grant really doing an extensive amount of research and focus groups on volunteers and researchers to figure out how best to engage the population and to understand the needs of researchers who might use such a platform. We designed it in such a way that there would be marginal costs and startup time for studies, and I'll, in a few slides, have a comparison of what these would cost compared to building your own app, for example. And we set it up so that we can do multimodality data collection using surveys, connected apps, connected devices, ecologically momentary assessments, and some electronic medical record integration. We learned early on when we started Healthy Heart that we had a lot of people approach us who wanted to collaborate with us. And with our initial platform before we started the Eureka project, it was such that those collaborators needed to fit what they wanted to do within our constraints. And so we learned from that lesson and built this platform to have customized user flows and customized experiences and customized branding. And so we really did build this platform primarily for collaboration, meaning that we here at UCSF run the platform, but we don't actually run the studies. We provide the infrastructure for the studies to be run. We provide advice and experience in running digital studies, but the PI of the studies are the PI of the study, and they control the majority of the aspects of it. The platform is built, again, for scalability and cost with a cloud backend that's custom built by us that runs on a HIPAA-compliant, secure, dedicated Amazon Web Services stack that talks to a dedicated app, either Android or iOS, but also can be used with just a web browser. And these are synchronized experiences for the user. A user can log into the app in a particular study and then later log into the web and continue where they were. So a single sign-on for all of those experiences. And then we've built a integrated study team interface for participant management, study management, updating consents, messaging participants, and I'll show you some examples of what that looks like in a little bit, as well as extensive reports that are run on a regular basis and data exports. So in order to do this scalably, we built what's called a multi-tenant system. The easiest way to think about it is that we built a building and we have shared plumbing and electricity and infrastructure, but each apartment is its own study and can be decorated and designed however you want to, taking into account all of the pipes and infrastructure that are there. The main components of the back end are that everything is driven through what are called REST APIs, meaning that the back end can push and pull information to and from our dedicated mobile app. Everything is highly configurable. We have a configurable, flexible, and intelligent messaging that allows for any combination of push notifications, email, SMS. We have a robust configurable survey engine that again can drive either web-based or mobile-based or both studies. And everything is done through a customizable task queue that can be triggered based on events or answers to surveys or time-based or combination thereof. We built a robust randomization engine that can accept complex randomization table schema, including strata, block randomization, et cetera. We have, based on our research early on, developed an engagement and gamification process within the app. This process is continuing to be developed and mature, but it is focused on altruism as the main driver for the engagement. And as mentioned, we have an integrated study management. So in order to keep development time and costs down, we developed one app that can dynamically deliver new studies, new study contents, can restrict which studies are exposed to particular participants, or can be an app where anybody who downloads the app can view available studies. And this is all, again, sort of pushed from our back end, and this allows us to do this in a time and cost-efficient manner. So our participant interface, our mobile or web interface, again, we have templated user flows that are based on lots of user feedback and experience, but those are customizable and able to be adapted for a particular study. Data can be shared across studies. I'll talk about that a little bit later in the discussion, but if a participant happens to be in more than one study that require the same kind of data collection, that data can be shared without having to double enter. Based on a lot of early experience and feedback from researchers and participants, study branding is front and center, so the Eureka brand sits way in the background, and the name and color scheme and messaging for each particular study can be unique and front and center. And as mentioned, everything is completely configurable. This is just sort of an example of two studies living within the same app. And again, you can see that they have a similar appearance in terms of the template and the features, but the color schemes are different, the branding is different, the messaging is different, and somebody would easily recognize that they were in one study versus another study. And as mentioned, we have studies on the app that are exclusive, meaning that somebody is invited to that particular study and they're not allowed to participate in any other study on the app until the study is finished. And we have other studies where people can participate in other studies, and they can participate in 2 or 3 studies all through the same app. We have ways to direct people to the right study on the app, and again, they can only see that study if they want. This is an example of that flow, where in this use case, there's a Facebook ad, but we've done this with email campaigns or other types of media to direct people to a study. They click on a link or text back a code. They get the link that downloads the app and then takes them directly just to that study within the app. We have lots of ways that we can bring people into the app to do tasks for a particular study. The most common way and the most effective way is with push notifications. So when there's an activity for them to do in a particular study, they get a push notification that says that their particular study needs them to do something, and they click on that, and it takes them to their task list, and they keep going. We've also incorporated this timeline feature that allows people to see where they are in the study. This is also presented at onboarding, so they could get a good sense of what the study looks like, and then as they progress through, this timeline changes. People may notice here that in this particular study, there's a gift card. That's not based on the app, that's based on the study. We can facilitate delivering it, but each study decides their own incentive structure. So I mentioned earlier that the goal really was to do this in a cost and time-effective way. So I have a comparison of, on the right-hand side, the costs for setting up a study on the platform today versus on the left, data on what it would cost to develop a dedicated app for a particular study. So on our platform, it's about $40,000 to set up a fairly straightforward study, and about $105,000 to set up a very complex study with lots of new integrations and new workflows. Whereas if you were to go to a development firm to make a new app dedicated for your study, all in with project management and design work and coding, even using ResearchKit or ResearchStack, you're talking at about $150,000 to $170,000 for a simple study, and about $500,000 for a very complex build with lots of new integrations. So our study process, interestingly, was one of these things we didn't anticipate was going to be a significant problem, but the platform's been very popular. We have upwards of 20 studies using the platform at various stages. And we've really had to spend the last year and a half refining and streamlining our intake process. One of the things we've learned is that few researchers have experience doing digital and mobile studies, and so there's a fair amount of back and forth on figuring out the right design for a digital study. But this is our process. We have a very lightweight intake process that lets us think about feasibility, scope of work, and budget. This can be used for pre-NIH submissions, and then once funded, we start our design process with the research team. This generally takes between 8 and 16 weeks, depending on the team's experience and the complexity of the study. But it involves designing user journeys and mock-ups, doing a little bit of user testing when appropriate, designing what kind of data reports are needed to conduct the study. once this is all done, we then enter into the build phase. And because our platform is built on templates and tried and true workflows, we can build a simple to moderate study in about 8 to 14 weeks. And that sort of is managed internally amongst our team. And then we generally leave about 2 weeks for testing before we go live, and then there's a maintenance once things go live. As mentioned before, we integrate with a bunch of devices and apps. This is just a smattering of them, and they range from scales to blood pressure cuffs to EKGs to diet apps, etc. A common question we get is, how do you deal with the IRB? Who's running the study? We've set this up so that our platform has internal UCSF IRB to be a data collection platform for another study. We have approval for our standard operating procedures in taking in studies and in informing the outside IRB the proper language around our privacy and security. But the outside IRB, outside researcher rather, is responsible for the IRB and consent, and we just ensure that that consent has our standard Eureka privacy and security language built in. And then our IRB at UCSF is just informed with a list of ongoing studies on the platform. Privacy and security is another common question we get. So we spent a fair amount of time thinking about the best, most cost-effective way to do this. And because state laws vary, we decided to go with the slightly more conservative approach. So our platform is HIPAA compliant. We have a dedicated stack on AWS that generates business associate agreements between us and AWS certifying the HIPAA compliance. We have all the standard security and redundancy that comes with the AWS stack. And the stack is overseen by the UCSF Privacy Office. So they do periodic privacy audits and penetration testing, et cetera. As mentioned in the previous slide, the identified data is governed by each study's IRB and consent. So who has access to the identified data is really regulated by the study team. Part of the standard language is that as the data collection entity, we may have access to identified information for use and purposes of maintaining the study, but not for any analyses. We also have a process for taking de-identified data and sharing it. As I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, that's one of our missions. But the timing and the type of data that happens is a joint decision with the outside researcher, the user, and our team. And this is still in iteration. But the concept is that the participant is in control of data sharing. They can share completed or common data across studies that they have consented to. So the key here is that if they're going to share data across two studies in an identified way, the participant will have needed to consent to both of those studies and agree to share across those studies. But they also have control over the de-identified data. They can choose not to share their de-identified data, and each study can decide the timing and type of data that can be shared into this de-identified data set. We also are asked about incentives a lot, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but incentives are study specific. Most studies, I would say, have no incentives. When there are incentives, they range from just free devices that they get to keep after the study to gift cards. And our user research suggests, and this has been our general suggestion to studies, is that messaging around monetary incentives are more focused on completing tasks rather than for participating in the study. And the reason we think that's important is that we don't want to change the altruistic motivation of why they participate in the study, because then consistent messaging that we have in our app can be confusing. And more importantly, we've seen examples of attrition in the study once they've gotten their gift card or their incentive or varied levels of engagement. So I just wanted to spend the rest of the time talking about some specific features and studies that are relevant to behavioral science, just as examples of things that are on the platform. One of our features is that we can do geofencing, so we can use geolocation to tag when a participant is in or near a particular type of structure. So in this example, we have 2 studies using this feature to ascertain hospitalizations. So we've set this feature up so that if a participant's phone is in the location of a hospital for more than 4 hours, the message to the right here, is triggered. I'm sorry, the next message will be triggered an hour after they leave, asking about whether they were hospitalized. This is the message I was referring to. This happens in this instance about an hour after they leave that hospital, and then we confirm that they were there for care or not for care, and then that triggers additional surveys to get more information. Again, these 2 studies are using it to actually get permission to collect the primary records from the hospital. We have another study that is looking at coffee intake, and we've geofenced all the coffee shops in the U.S. We've built this to be customizable, so the type of location or locations for each study is determined by that particular study, and we use the Google Places API to identify what the location type is. We've developed an algorithm that calculates the probability that they are actually in that location, and we can set that a level trigger for sending the message or setting the flag. We can program the duration of stay. We can program the interval between updates to minimize battery drain, and the smallest distance between updates to be more precise. And as I mentioned, we've optimized this to really prevent impact on battery. Our data suggests it has less than 1% effect on battery drainage doing it this way. I've already mentioned this. This is the coffee study I talked about. So I'm going to mention some of the studies that are on the platform that have a behavioral intervention bent. We currently have 21 studies running on the platform. We have 30 projects in the pipeline, and we are open for new projects if people have ideas where they think our platform might help facilitate their research. I will mention, though, that there is a little bit of a queue. it turns out that there's a pretty big need for such a platform, and so we've been busier than we anticipated. Good problem to have. But so this is a study that's nearing completion. It's called TREAT. It's a dietary intervention. It's a randomized trial comparing regular spaced meals 3 times a day versus time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting, although in this case it's not intermittent. It's daily 16-hour fasts. We have a pretty robust set of daily reminders and push notifications about what their plan is and whether they should be eating or not eating during this time. So if they're on the regular meal plan, they get a push notification during breakfast, lunch, and dinner saying that they should be eating a meal over the next few hours. Whereas if they're in their fasting phase, in that group, they get a message that says they should not be eating. Primary outcome is weight. Secondary outcomes are blood pressure, mood, activity, compliance, and a ASA 24 at 3 time points during the study. We enrolled all 200 participants that were needed for this. This is just an example of the 2 randomization arms. They get within the app the messaging and meal plans so they can follow that during their intervention. If you click on See My Eating Plan, this is kind of what it looks like. So this is always there as a reference or when their push notification occurs. We, in this study, have an integration with both a scale and a blood pressure cuff, where within the app they add integration and they get reminders to weigh themselves daily and to check their blood pressure 3 times a week. The study also has a in-person component for those that live in the Bay Area. They're invited to come in 3 times during the study to get extensive metabolic testing, once at baseline, once in the middle of the intervention, and once at the end of the intervention. Again, for this, they do get a gift card for each of these visits. The next study has just completed enrollment about 3 weeks ago. It's called Healthy Hearts, Healthy Minds. The question for this randomized trial is whether they can increase activity in patients with mild depression. It's, as I mentioned, an RCT, a 3-arm randomization. The first arm is a combination of mindfulness plus a Fitbit. The second arm is a CBT intervention plus a Fitbit. And then the control group is just a Fitbit only. The primary outcome are step counts and change in step count. And we enrolled 500 participants, largely through our volunteer cohort that I mentioned earlier, but also through some advertising on the web and advocacy groups. This is a study that we just launched that is sort of an interesting behavioral intervention to see if we can affect lifestyle change in AFib. So this is an N-of-1 trial or a micro-randomized trial funded by PCORI, where patients who have intermittent atrial fibrillation can identify triggers that they think trigger their episodes, and then they do a micro-randomization to those triggers over an extended period of time, and the app is used to do the randomization, the messaging, as well as the outcome ascertainment. So everybody gets this little device at the bottom, which is a iPhone or smartphone connected EKG device that connects in through the app, and they check their EKG daily or when they have symptoms. Again, we used our volunteer cohort. This is now a week old. We've enrolled about 350 participants in 3 weeks. So we're approaching the end of enrollment for this study in a very short period of time. This is just some examples of some of the text messaging and in-app messages that they get to, again, have them avoid or not avoid their particular triggers. And then we've built an interface where they can see their data. In the example screen to the left, this is tracking their mood and when they have AFib in red versus no AFib in blue. On the right is tracking their sleep. And on the far right is when they've avoided their caffeine trigger, for example, and had AFib or not. The next study is a behavioral intervention to enhance breast cancer screening in patients who've survived childhood cancer and chest radiation. It's an RCT, and again, the two arms are just patient activation with a letter versus patient activation using a mobile app with reminders and videos and resources. This is an NCI-funded study and uses an existing childhood cancer cohort called the CCSS, or Childhood Cancer Survivor Study Cohort. Primary outcome is breast cancer screening. We began enrollment just 2 weeks ago. Again, this is just what some of the messaging looks like. They get text messaging. They get in-app messaging where they can see the resources, including in the app. They can see videos that sort of talk about things like how do they get insurance to cover this? Is insurance covered? How do they go about scheduling tests, et cetera? I'm going to now shift gears in the last 5 minutes or so and just sort of talk about some of the features and data available to the research teams to run the studies. We have built into the app and the web analytics, so we can look at funnels. Where do people get hung up in a study? Where are people, continuing? And this is a pretty typical study, and we look at this at the platform level to see how our app is doing with various things. So in this particular study, about 90% of the people that hit the app completed the eligibility period. Of those, only 24% were eligible. So this study has a pretty strict eligibility criteria. However, 96% of those that were eligible went on and signed a consent, and 85% went on to move through the study. And you can see once you get to that point, there's fairly good engagement for the rest of the study in this particular study. This is what the study-specific study management portal looks like. There's essentially 4 main areas. The participant management section I'll talk about in a second. Messaging, where you can manage the messages in the study, and then reports. Queries is still under development. So this is what the participant management site looks like. It gives a nice overview of where people are with this particular study. If one clicks on a user here, it gives them the ability to manage password reset, see where they are in the study. For example, what consents they have or have not consigned and when, what devices have been consented, where they are in the study and when they completed it. There's a place where you can make notes so that if you have multiple coordinators managing this, one coordinator can leave a message and the other coordinator can see that the next time this person calls in for help or whatever. This is what the messaging and communications panel looks like. You can look at email campaigns or other messaging to see completions. You can design new messages that go out, et cetera. And then reports also are available. We run the reports nightly. We have a series of stock reports that continue to grow that are available for every study, but we can also generate custom reports for specific needs within a study. And then data is exported on a daily basis to an S3 bucket, which is just a place on Amazon that is specific to each study that the study team can go and grab the CSV files that are added to every single day for analysis. So I was told to leave adequate time for questions, so this is my last slide. And this sort of just gives, this is our overview website for researchers that if people have information, they can go to info.eurekaplatform.org. But as with most of these things, if people are interested, it's probably worth talking to somebody on our staff about whether the study is a good fit and what we do would make sense for what you're thinking about. So I'll stop there for questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Olgin. I will now begin with the question and answer session. To ask a question or send a comment, click on the Q&A on your screen, select all panelists, and type in your question and send. We have a few questions already, if you don't mind, Dr. Olgin. The first one is, have you looked into customized ways to return results to research participants, either some, all, or none, depending on participant preference?
Yes. So this is a very good and complicated topic, and I'll try to answer briefly. So we do have on the app and on the web the ability for users to see some of their own data. I showed you some of that in the N of 1 study where they actually can see their tracking data. People can see their blood pressure data or their other data that they provide through sensors or through input. We have not yet built the interface for all the survey data to be fed back. It is on our to-do list, but that is not yet available. It's an interesting topic because how users want to see their data back is complicated. There is a common assumption that people want to participate in this kind of research in order to see their data. Our experience and our focus group suggests that that is a fringe group of people and a minor motivation for people to participate, and that altruism is a bigger motivation. That said, what seems to be consistent is that people want feedback that the data they are providing is being received and being used and how it's being used. So the feature on our to-do list that is not complete yet is to build a semi-real-time response that when somebody responds to a survey, we are able to give them feedback that says something to the effect, you're one of, or, your data has, is the millionth data point in this study to find a new treatment for diabetes. You're in the top 5th percentile of people with diabetes contributing this data. Things like those are what, in our experience and focus groups, sort of motivate people to participate in research. And then lastly, I'll say they want to see the impact, the data at the end. So if they finish the study, we're really encouraging the research teams to feed back results of the study to participants. There's lots of ways to do that. So, sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded answer, but it's a very complicated topic that doesn't have a simple solution.
That's great, thank you. Another question, can you talk about the demographics or clinical characteristics of your user volunteer base?
Yes, also an excellent question. So it is evolving pretty rapidly. We have very broad representation by age. I think the median age is around 55, but we have plenty of users up into the 80s. It is, I believe, now 50-50 women and men. It used to be more women than men, but it's now, I think, pretty close to 50-50. It is, unfortunately, largely white, although our African American and Hispanic contribution is increasing, but not at the pace we want. And it is a middle-class SES in general. Again, we have some studies where we've specifically enrolled minorities or lower SES. So, for example, we had a study that the University of Maryland was doing where they specifically enrolled people at a free dental clinic using a novel text messaging onboarding process that we've now adopted platform-wide. And those efforts were successful, but the free form join if you want to volunteer has yielded a slightly skewed volunteer population.
Okay, thank you. A two-part question, they're related, so I'm putting them together. For an NIH project, is it possible to request your team to develop the first version app with the features supported by your platform?
If somebody is saying something, they're muted.
Can you hear me? Hello? Are we on? Can you hear me, Dr. Olgin? Can you hear me?
Dr. Olgin, can you hear us?
Sorry, I'm not hearing anything, so I don't know if...
Dr. Olgin, can you hear us now?
Erica, can you still hear me?
I can still hear you.
Muted.
Can you not hear us?
Can you type?
Hello? Hello?
We're still on, Dr. Olgin.
Hello?
We'll type the questions to you.
We're live because I can hear you on this.
So I think Dr. Olgin lost audio connection. Dr. Olgin, I'm going to email you. You may just need to call back in.
Can you see the text thing here? No.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, we're still on. Can you not hear us?
Hello?
Yes, can you hear us? We're still here. I think everyone can hear us.
Yeah, everybody, they can hear us.
So we'll give it just a minute and see if Dr. Olgin can dial back in and we can sort this out. If not,
maybe we can send them the questions.
yeah, we'll take the questions that people have been submitting and send them to Dr. Olgin and try to get back to people.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, that was.
But there's a bit of an echo.
I can try to change communication again, but that's strange. It just, I don't know where everybody lost me, but I'll try one more time to go back to the phone.
Hello? Can you hear me again?
Yes, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Okay, that was very strange. I don't know if my answer was heard or not.
It was perfect. Everyone heard it. Thank you.
Okay.
If you have a few more minutes, we have a few more. I'm going to ask a compound question, which is somewhat related. For an NIH project, is it possible to request your team to develop the first version of the app with the features supported by your platform, but then to take the source code to develop it ourselves, coming from the questioner, further for additional research-dependent features? Related, is the source code for the mobile clients and backend available? If yes, under what license? If no, why not?
Okay, good question. So I'll answer the last one first. Yes, the code will be open source when it's mature. It will be under an open source license. So there will be, much like the other UC-wide open source licenses, there'll be some licensing arrangement. For-profits will likely have to pay a licensing fee, but it'll be similar to Spark, for example, if you guys are familiar with Spark, which is under an open source UC license. The first part of the question is, can you take the source code and implement it? The short answer is, yeah, but it's a heavy lift because the app isn't really a source code. The app just talks to our back end. So you need the entire infrastructure to run the study. It is, there are a lot of pieces to running it and running the platform that I think it's probably A, not cost effective to do that, and B, probably pretty unlikely that somebody would be able to do that. Because again, it's in order to keep costs down, it's not a standalone app. It's a back-end platform that runs the study and delivers it to web, to app, et cetera.
Great.
There was a middle part of that question, but I can't remember what it was.
No, I think you handled it very well.
Okay.
A few more questions. Can the platform link participants between each other? In other words, parent to child,
yes,
or patient to patient?
So parent to child, yes. We have a current pediatric study going on now where the parent actually does the consent and links and actually sets up the child account, and both the child and the parent can do different parts of the study. We have not yet had a study where two participants who were not parent-child linked, and we'd have to think about the use case to make that work, but in theory, we'd use the same process we're doing with the parent-child.
Great. Has this application been used in any international studies? Are there language options other than English?
We do have international participants in the study. Currently, they are participating in English. We have two studies that are in the middle of the development pipeline that will bring multilinguality to the platform. So I'd say within 6 to 12 months, we'll be able to have different languages fairly easily.
Is it possible to customize the geofencing notifications?
Yes, they are right now customizable. So, for example, the coffee geofencing message is very different than the hospitalization one. So yes, it's easy to do that.
Okay. Can a small business use the system? What are the implications for commercialization?
A small business can use the platform. We have lots of startups that are using the platform. There's a couple of important caveats. One is that this is a research platform, so there needs to be a PI somewhere, and there needs to be an IRB somewhere, and there needs to be, a knowledgeable, responsible research team, number one. Number two, our engagement and sort of pact with our users are that we're doing impactful medical research. And so we don't do market research. We don't do, do you think this consumer grade blood pressure cuff is attractive? We don't do that kind of stuff. So whatever is on this has to be meaningful, impactful, and responsible medical research.
Okay. Related to that, how is intellectual property handled between UCSF and PI when developing interventions?
The platform is the intellectual property of UCSF. The intervention or anything that the research team develops is their IP, and that's clearly spelled out. Where it gets muddy, so this may be getting into the weeds a little bit more than needed, but we set this up as a cost recovery recharge. So if somebody just wants to use the platform, then there's a procurement contract that covers the cost. And in that contract, the IP is spelled out that anything that the research outside entity team develops is their IP, and the platform is our IP. Where it gets a little muddy is if the research teams want our intellectual input and our knowledge on engaging people in these types of studies, and we have effort or a real research contract, then in that contract we have to spell out specifically what the IP guardrails are.
Well, in the sake of time, I want to thank you. I have one last question, and then I think we're going to bring it to a close. Can you give us some examples of what would qualify as a simple versus complex study?
Yes. So a simple study is something where there's a consent, pretty straightforward eligibility that doesn't require sort of programming new difficult logic like calculating a score, referencing some, outside, normal table or something, but, just yes, no's to these questions. So simple eligibility, simple randomization, consent, and, survey completion, and the visits or the activities are just very simple time-based, once a week you have to do these surveys kind of thing. That's a simple build.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike, for moderating the Q&A, and thanks, Dr. Olgin, for your presentation on the Eureka Research Platform. Very informative. Also want to thank everybody that joined online today. If you have colleagues who are unable to join and you think they'd be interested in the topic, please know that a recording of today's webinar will be available in about 2 weeks on the OBSSR website and OBSSR's YouTube page. The next and final, go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, I just want to offer, people are welcome to email me if they have questions that we didn't talk about. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem at all. Thank you. That's very generous. We really appreciate that. We collected some of the additional questions that were asked that we just couldn't get to, so I think Erica will probably be sending those to you as well, so we can try to get people's questions answered. Thank you.
All right.
Final announcements is that the next and final webinar in our 2019 OBSSR Directors Webinar Series will be held on Tuesday, September 24th, and our guest presenter will be Dr. Felicia Hill-Briggs. She's the Senior Director of Population Health Research and Development and a Professor of Medicine at Johns Hopkins Healthcare, and she's going to present on healthcare delivery for underserved populations with diabetes, focusing on care delivery systems and reimbursement paradigms. So make sure you've signed up to receive email update messages about upcoming OBSSR events. The link to sign up to receive updates is available on our website at obssr.od.nih.gov. And this concludes today's webinar. We look forward to your participation in September. Thank you again for attending. Thank you, Dr. Olgin, for a great presentation, and we wish everybody a great rest of today.